Okay, I can start us off then. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly webinar. My name is Anjana, and this is Jana. We've got Dr. Curnew and Brad here. We're from the Cooking Club, and today, as you can see from our title, we're going to be embracing the power of plant-based protein. So before we get into the webinar and our content, I want everyone to kind of think about the last bit of protein that they consumed. Is it a burger? Is it bacon? Or maybe is it a lean meat like chicken or salmon? There's no judgment here. And today we're gonna hope to change perhaps what that last protein source you consumed is, or the last one that you're able to recognize. You've probably been told many times to eat healthier and to maybe target protein in this sentiment. However, as dietary guidelines across the world begin to shift recommendations towards including more plant-based proteins and plant-based foods under protein foods, the need to understand why this shift is so important to your health and well-being is imminent. And additionally, while we continue to shift our focus to building more muscle for individuals of all ages, but also older adults, the need to understand how plant-based proteins contribute to muscle strengthening and cardiovascular risk prevention is also a priority. So, without further ado, let's begin with the power up and learning about muscles and plant-based proteins and all things good for your health. And we'll start with a quiz for Dr. Curnew here. And for everybody watching, you can sort of quiz yourself on these two as we go through them. But we won't reveal the answers until the end. So the first one, Dr. Curnew, and we'll keep just answers to yes or no. Protein intake is, or true or false, protein intake is most effective for muscle maintenance when consumed in a single large meal rather than spread throughout the day.
False.
Okay. Second question, sarcopenia refers to the natural age-related loss of muscle mass and strength.
I'm going to say maybe, because what happens to many of us is that we lose muscle mass as we age, but we don't have to let that happen to the same degree. So we do have some degree of muscle mass, but we are in control of how much we do lose.
Okay. How about resistance training combined with adequate protein intake can help prevent or reverse sarcopenia?
Partially.
Okay. Plant-based proteins are insufficient for maintaining muscle health in older adults.
False.
And amino acids, particularly leucine, play a critical role in stimulating muscle protein synthesis.
Yes.
Okay, so for everybody at home, hopefully you've been noting down some of your responses, and at the end, we'll go through what these answers are. But for now, I'll pass it off to Dr. Curnew to kind of set us off on understanding why it's important to understand our protein sources, more particularly in understanding our body composition as well.
So as we recall the start of the pandemic, most of us actually didn't go to the gym. We watched Netflix, and we didn't do a good job. But I realized that once your body mass index was less than or above 24, mortality from COVID increased. So we know that inflammation plays an important role in many disease processes, including infection. And so I started to work very hard to try to build some muscle, because I lost some weight initially, but I also lost some fat. And over time, I discovered that my brother fell and broke a couple bones. My parents had issues about falling, especially my mom. And I decided I'm losing my balance. So I want to actually prevent myself from falling. And so one of the things that prevents falling is having bigger muscles and sense of balance. And unfortunately, last April, I discovered that my hemoglobin A1C went from 5.7% to 6.6%, meaning the definition of diabetes. Well, the actual true definition is that you need two consecutive values. So I had one. And what happened during the pandemic, my peak weight before the pandemic was 185. I got it down to around 176-ish or so. I actually got down to 165 and went back up to 176. And I plateaued around that number. And what happened next was, this is actually, look at my weight. This is actually today or yesterday's or whatever, my weight is 158.4 pounds. This is, all the numbers are in the green. I have enough muscle and I got rid of a lot of fat. So right now I'm trying to keep my weight down to less than 160 pounds. So basically I lost about 27 pounds in the last few years. And it's been a tough journey. Will I be able to do this or not? The most important part of putting diabetes into remission is weight reduction. You need to lose 20 to 30 pounds. And if you can do that and keep it off at a year later, you have about a 70% chance of putting diabetes into remission. 7-0. Notice I don't use the word cure, because once you make the diagnosis of diabetes, half the cells that make insulin are usually dead and the rest are working overtime. Now, I thought I was doing a good job because I, lost some weight. I was exercising. My diet's not unreasonable, but that nighttime eating, and that time too is that there was sales of chocolate. And I figure if there's a sale for chocolate, it doesn't count. But unfortunately it does count. And so this has been a long journey, and I'm, it's taken me 65 years to achieve the best body composition that I can remember a long time. I don't remember my body composition when I was 18 years of age, but in my adult life, I was always just a little bit on the pudgy side. And I also had a triglyceride of over 2, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. So a long story to say is that keep fighting, keep working hard. Will I be able to put my diabetes into remission? We'll tell you a little bit more as time goes on. But one of the things to build muscle is don't get older. But if you are going to get older, you need to do weight training. So to me, weight training, resistance training, lifting heavy weights, bands, push-ups, whatever you want to do, and we'll do some push-ups afterwards, is the best way to decrease the weight, the muscle mass, and eating properly. And as we're going to talk about, the number one best source of protein on the planet is beans. I'll repeat that. The best source of protein for the environment, for health, is beans. And so I'm going to encourage everybody to think about how to add a half a cup to at least a cup of beans per day for the rest of your life. The only people that won't like that is your next door neighbor, because the gas production might go up initially. But if you share the beans with everybody, good things will happen. And we're going to actually prove that. So I'm really proud of this number. We'll be able to achieve that. And right now, my diabetes is potentially in remission. We'll have to talk a little bit more about that. And we'll go from there. Brad, anything else you want to say about this?
That's all good. I think what I would think about is injury prevention. You just hurt your hip, and I'm not saying it's going to continue. I've also hurt my knee a little bit, recovering, but it's been putting me back from running for about a month, and I'm kind of doing it, kind of not doing it. So if you are doing resistance training, make sure you invest in a personal trainer. If you've never lifted weights before, that's one. Using machines over free weights, just some safety things, Take it slowly. And just keep doing it for a long time. That's the most important thing. And I'll
Yeah.
just pass it off to the rest of the team. And
Yeah,
Jenna, take it
good
away.
point. Because I'm injured now. I'm still doing some stuff, but I'm really annoyed. And you're right. I'm not doing this on my own. I thank Darren at a squash club for being the hell out of me. I thank the group at our physio in Dundas about that, and we meet the crack of dawn and all the people there. So we're going to get there. But yeah, right now I'm a little setback, but just hopefully it will be a minor setback. I re-injured it. I'm getting better again, but I'll keep working at it. Good point. Tell us more.
So I guess from what you said, Dr. Curnew, it's clear that, a mix of diet, a mix of resistance training, all of these are very important in supporting muscle strengthening, which is going to help in preventing preventing the progression of chronic conditions. And then, as Brad mentioned, also injury prevention. So I'll pass it off to Jana to kind of explain why muscle is important and some of the science behind the muscles in your body.
Yeah, so as we kind of mentioned, muscles are a really important part of allowing you to perform everyday tasks, whether it's like walking, moving around, playing sports, things like that. And it makes up a large part of our body. And in looking at specifically adults over the age of 70, age-related mobility limitations affect 30% of adults over the age of 70, which can increase the risks of falls, chronic diseases, and mortality. So in speaking about muscles, that leads us to our next slide about sarcopenia. So sarcopenia, what is it? It is the disuse or age-related loss of muscle and strength, which contributes to the increased risks and age-related mobility limitations. On a cellular level, as we can see in the picture here, sarcopenia is when there is a reduced number of muscle fibers, and you can also see that they are smaller in size. In looking at how it relates to energy and diet, sarcopenia results from a negative caloric state or lack of specific nutrients from, for example, malnutrition. In particular, sarcopenia tends to be a result of a deficiency in micronutrients like protein, which we should be consuming at least 0.7 to 0.8 grams per kilogram of body mass per day. Older individuals tend to need more protein in comparison to younger populations. However, older populations tend to consume less food, and as a result, they're more susceptible to developing sarcopenia. And looking at the statistics between the ages of 40 and 70 years old, it is estimated that energy intake decreases by 25%, resulting in inadequate intake of macro and micronutrients.
Well, it's kind of interesting to talk about how much protein to get. And I think there's a debate somewhere between 0.7 to 2 grams per kilogram per day, depending on who you believe and what you think about. A couple things, as you get old, as you point out, is that you might need more protein to maintain muscle mass. People who do vigorous exercise, elite athletes, will aim for higher protein content in their diet. And we'll talk about the quality of protein. So, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is actually increase my protein intake for a couple of reasons. If your blood sugar is high, that means you have too much carbohydrate in your bloodstream right now. And basically, the more carbohydrate you have, you eat, the more carbohydrate you'll get in your bloodstream. And the more muscles you build, the more carbohydrate you get from your bloodstream to your muscles. You want your muscles will be the number one source or storage place for carbohydrates. So you need to think about that. So, and also it is because if you suffer from insulin resistance diabetes, is that having protein in your diet, it doesn't cause the spikes in blood sugar. It makes that less rising. So lots of reasons right now is I'm trying to increase my protein intake to help control my blood sugar, to help satiate myself, so I eat less, and build muscle as well. So I'm aiming for about 1.5 grams per day or so at this point in time, but I don't have a specific amount, but I'm trying to eat more of that for all sorts of reasons. And then you'll see a lot of controversy in that area there. So I think these are important issues. But tell us a bit more about sarcopenia.
Yeah, for sure. So we will touch on sarcopenia and diabetes later in just a second. But yeah, so sarcopenia is initiated not only through lack of physical activity, but also hormonal shifts in older adults, which lead to decreased muscle repair and higher rates of muscle protein degradation. In addition, genetics, environmental factors, and lifestyle can impact the development of sarcopenia. Meta-analyses have shown that the prevalence of sarcopenia is 2 to 3 times higher in patients with type 2 diabetes in comparison to patients without diabetes. In relating sarcopenia to diabetes, studies have found that the activation of the ACE pathway contributes to insulin resistance and also muscle atrophy. And then in terms of physical inactivity, this can dysregulate antioxidant cellular pathways, increasing the susceptibility to oxidative stress, which can damage muscle proteins. And then smoking is another risk factor for skeletal muscle dysfunction. Smoking can cause oxidative stress and decrease the production of genes responsible for mitochondrial function, so that impacts the energy production in muscles, and also neuromuscular junctions, so where the sites where nerves connect to muscle fibers. So that can lead to muscle damage and movement issues. And finally, we can also see here like alcohol consumption can also increase the risk of sarcopenia. So what happens is if we have excessive alcohol consumption, that can harm liver cells, which leads to the buildup of ammonia. And then when ammonia builds up in the body, this can trigger autophagy in cells, which is where protein muscle is broken down. And ammonia also is a compound, or yeah, it's also a compound that prevents the synthesis of new muscle protein.
So it's kind of interesting is that sarcopenia just means loss of muscle, which could be up to 50%. And you mentioned one of the things is sleep. One of the things that I really am working harder at as we get older, our sleep gets more fragmented. I don't sleep as well. And I get my best sleep at the start of night. And so I'm trying to go to bed earlier and spend more time in bed. And I think that's to help to, it does a lot of good things. So I've neglected sleep for many years. I'm trying to work on that aspect of my life. So thank you for sharing that. And you can see, oh, too bad about alcohol. Alcohol used to be good for you. Now there's nothing good about alcohol. The best amount of alcohol is 0, unfortunately. And I don't understand why both federal governments and provincial governments are trying to get more access to deadly substances. And so, but that's, I guess I'm trying not to kill myself. I'm trying to make myself live longer and prosper for as long as I can. And doesn't mean I can't enjoy and drink from time to time, but I try not to drink on a regular basis. So the best amount of alcohol is less than 2 drinks per week.
Right. So next we'll move on to the benefits of muscle strengthening. So this is really important in terms of, like we said, building those muscles, fall prevention, mobility, independence, and also weight management. So like we kind of touched on, not only does diet impact the risk in development of sarcopenia, but strength training can also have protective effects against sarcopenia and the associated risks, and even help reverse it. So with strength training, balance training exercises, and multi-component exercises, this can increase balance outcomes, mobility, and reduce the risk of falls. Exercise increases muscle mass, and that works by activating signaling pathways that can promote the synthesis of muscle protein and signaling pathways involved in muscle fiber function and metabolism. One way that it works is through the mitochondria. So, like we mentioned, the powerhouse of the cell. This is really important for providing energy to muscles and also metabolism throughout the entire body. Mitochondria are really sensitive to contractile signals. So, that would be like the contraction and relaxation of muscles during exercise. So, when they receive these signals, this can help them with maintaining healthy cells throughout the body. Mitochondria are smaller and have slower metabolism and reduced biosynthesis in aging skeletal muscle, which can result in decreased muscle mass. However, if we do exercise, then we can increase mitochondrial function and increase volume by up to 40%, which is good for strength and building muscle mass.
So it's kind of
Sorry,
interesting
go
about
ahead.
muscle mass is that, again, is that building muscle mass is good for lots of reasons. One of the things it basically takes in sugar. And one of the guys I play squash with had type 2 diabetes, and his hemoglobin A1C was about 13%, which is a terrible number. Now he's a young guy in his 30s, and his best treatment for his diabetes is to play squash 2 hours most days. And he's really muscular. He's worked hard at that, and he's lowered his blood sugar dramatically by building muscle and losing some fat. Now that's an extreme, and he has a young, healthy pancreas. He still requires some medications, but he's taking a fraction of the medications that I thought he'd use, and I never saw that example so portrayed there. And everything gets harder as we get older, but man, oh man, is building muscle prevents you from the nursing home, helps your blood sugar, helps build stamina, helps prevent falls, and so on and so on. And mitochondria are those energy producers of the cells. So really important to develop burn energy. And you mentioned that we lose as we age, our caloric intake required when decrease. One of the things is we lose muscle. So if you want to be able to eat more like I do, you got to build muscle. Tell us more.
Yeah, so we're just going to skip ahead a little bit. So just briefly, yeah, so we were going to touch on muscle protein synthesis, and yeah, so like we mentioned, that's a really important part of how we are actually able to get muscle. So like it's incorporating amino acids into skeletal muscle protein. Um, and something to note is that with muscle protein synthesis, it usually lasts about 4 to 5 hours after eating. And so, because of that, it's important to eat protein not only at rest, but also after exercise so that we're able to have these amino acids stimulating protein synthesis. And then also, in terms of consuming protein after exercise, more amino acids are used towards muscle protein synthesis for up to 24 hours after we do exercise.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jana. I think that was a pretty comprehensive introduction to all things muscle. We touched on muscle protein synthesis and we kind of alluded to diet, which we're going to get into now. So, this is where the real power up comes in learning about plant based protein sources, which is what we're trying to convey in this webinar to you. So, as mentioned earlier, dietary guidelines across the world have actually begun to recognize the importance of plant based proteins in their dietary recommendations. Now, Rad and I came across this video a couple days ago, but most recently, the US has actually made a historic shift in their dietary guidelines. And this has including more plant based foods on their protein foods list. Currently, the list actually only includes soy products, nuts, and seeds on that list. And with the new recommendations, beans, lentils, and peas are now going to be incorporated. And as Dr. Curnew mentioned before, beans are actually one of the most important sources of plant-based protein, a protein that you're going to get, and a main takeaway from this webinar. So it's really monumental that they're making the shift. Whether guidelines are actually followed and incorporated by people is another question, as mentioned in that video. But it's still a shift in including recommendations of a broader range of protein sources and acknowledging that there's a growing demand for diverse and accessible health promoting food options. And actually, on this recommendation, they are including these plant based proteins in priority. So before animal protein sources like meat, poultry, eggs, fish, etc. So this growing body of research that's highlighting the benefits of plant-based proteins is actually making actionable steps in updating guidelines and hoping to encourage more individuals like you and myself to incorporate more plant-based sources into our everyday diets for more sustainable diets, both for our own livelihoods and for the planet, as we've alluded to in the beginning and we'll get to shortly. So there's a question that we want to answer throughout this webinar, and that's why plant-based over meat? So before we get into what some of these plant-based proteins are, we want to understand why they're better than animal sources. So recent dietary shifts emphasizing plant-based proteins reflect large amounts of strong evidence of their health benefits. So we have a 2022 meta-analysis here that found that replacing just one daily serving of unprocessed red meat with legumes actually reduced the risk of coronary heart disease by 17%. So already there we have cardiovascular risk prevention. Additionally, regular red meat consumption is associated with a 61% increase in cardiovascular risk and a 62% likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes. And this is for a number of reasons, including components in red meats. Red meat's a carcinogen. It also contains components such as carotene that promote other pathways that can promote inflammation. And also, red meats contain higher amounts of saturated fats, which we'll get into later. And even poultry, along with processed and unprocessed red meats, has been linked to an elevated risk of type 2 diabetes. So, what these findings are highlighting is that there is an urgency to prioritize plant based proteins to improve heart health, overall health, and reduce chronic disease risk, which we described a little bit before. And plant based proteins right now are looking about the better option than the traditional meats or traditional proteins that you might find on your plate.
Just a quick point, Angela. It's very interesting that it says it was unprocessed red meat where they found an association for, because there's a lot of talk in epidemiology or when they observe people who eat red meat. that the data from processed meat is mixed with unprocessed meat, that they've tried to separate that. Essentially, McDonald's red meat, then the meat that you buy yourself and you know the source of it, etc. But it's interesting that here, even unprocessed red meat has a little bit of a connection. Now, I don't think this is the entire story, but it's interesting that there's pros and cons on both sides. But beans are just a wonderful source that a lot of people don't know about. I certainly didn't know about it, and thanks to your videos, I've learned about them. But tell us more.
So actually, it's really important you mentioned that. So by far is that if you go back to, so the worst meat is processed meat. I always say that bacon is cancer on a stick. And then if you substitute that for, let's say, red meat, you get good protein, but you also get a lot of carcinogen effects too as well. And how you cook it too makes an important issue. But beans are actually a healthier version of the protein for the environment, for your health, and it makes you feel full. And they're cheaper. So, you have something that's less expensive, that's better for the planet, better for your health, better for your weight, better for your diabetes, better for cancer. Why aren't we doing it? Tell us more.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned that, both Brad and Dr. Curnew, in terms of sometimes we tend to label things in our head as, the burger is the unhealthy, is the one to avoid. But as we're going to see in this webinar, plant-based proteins are going to make their way up the hierarchy here, even amongst the lean meats that we see in traditional diets, such as, or recommended diets, like the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet. Plant-based protein sources, are good competitors to those more lean meats and unprocessed meats that, might find their way into other dietary recommendations. Okay, so on this slide, we have a 2020 meta-analysis, which is actually the largest meta-analysis on protein consumption and mortality risk. So this included 700,000 participants, and what the researchers found was that higher plant protein intake is actually linked to a lower risk of all-cause and cardiovascular mortality, which you'll see in that solid line as it dips below 1. While diets that were rich in animal protein, particularly from red and processed meats in this one, were associated with an increased risk of death from all causes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer, although I think these findings weren't incredibly significant. But still, we see this difference between the animal protein and the plant protein. And we see this demonstrated in the graph as well. And the study also identified a dose-response relationship, which is something to kind of understand a little bit better. So an incremental increase in plant protein consumption was able to further reduce mortality risk, highlighting the significant health benefits of even small dietary changes. So what that was an additional 3% of energy from plant proteins per day was associated with the 5% lower risk of mortality, all-cause mortality, or death from all causes. So when we convert this, for the sake of this webinar, we're using about a 2,000 calorie a day diet. Now, that might not apply to you. We have a video, it's called How Have You Been Reading That Label? I'm not sure if we linked it later, but this goes into how to calculate your daily caloric intake. For the sake of this video, we're making a generalization for a 2,000 calorie a day diet. So when we convert this 3% increase in energy from plant proteins to a 2,000 calorie a day diet for grams, this actually equates to about 15 grams of protein, which is very attainable. And we'll see when we go through our protein sources how this can be attainable through plant-based proteins. So what these results are really underscoring is the importance of shifting towards plant-based proteins further. Okay, so this is where we get into some of this plant-based protein sources. So Brad, if you just skip to the next slide. I took this image from the Heart and Stroke Foundation, and what I want everyone that's watching right now to do, and we're going to do a deeper dive into the nutritional background of some of these plant-based protein sources that you might recognize on the screen. What I want everyone to do right now is to maybe pause the webinar if you're watching this recorded, and use it as a bingo sheet. Cross-check what plant food items you might have in your kitchen, in your fridge, in your pantry, and maybe what you might not already have. So what the sheet represents are some common plant-based protein sources that are recommended, like I said, by the Heart and Stroke Foundation, and that you might already be consuming. And as we progress through the webinar, we hope that you can learn more about these items that you might be consuming already. And if you aren't, more about why you should be incorporating them. And then also how they're contributing to different aspects of your health. So that's just a quick overview. But on the next couple of slides, what we've done is highlight a couple ones that perhaps Dr. Curnew's brought to our attention while in the clinic when we're discussing nutrition, as well as some that kind of apply to our own lives. So on this slide, we have tempeh, which is actually a fermented soybean. Soybeans are really popular in our clinic here, and there's two types of soybeans that we're going to see here, soy byproducts here on this slide. We have the tempeh, which is the fermented soybeans, and the edamame, which is another type of soybean. We see the tempeh is really a protein powerhouse. It's got about 34 grams of protein per cup, and it's very much rich in fiber and probiotics, which support your gut health. I don't know if many people have heard of it, but there's ways to incorporate it into your diet through salads, through incorporating it through a healthy stir fry, or even grilling it, up to debate on how you cook that, as long as you're not putting sodium or added salt or oils on top. But the other one that we have here is cooked lentils. And this is one that I'm very passionate about. We had a microgreens webinar or workshop recently where we presented cooked lentils to some of the patients in our clinic. And I was able to give them, and we'll go through a recipe for this at the end, a recipe for a lentil curry. So lentils are a staple in my family because a lot of my family members are vegetarian. And surprise, surprise, with the South Asian background, are also at risk for many chronic illnesses. So it's really important that people like my mom are getting enough protein. So lentils are definitely a staple. As we see here, 1 cup of cooked lentils has about 18 grams of protein. On some sources, I found that it had more, but I'd say about 18 to 20 grams of protein per 1 cup of cooked lentils. And like Dr. Curnew said, lentils are very cheap, and a small amount goes a long way when you're cooking them, if you're buying the dried lentils. Lentils are also packed with iron, which we'll get to later, which is sometimes a concern for people when they are referencing reducing the red meat consumption. Where's my iron going to go? But lentils are packed with iron, folate, fiber, and we'll get into some of these later. But this is ultimately a heart-healthy choice, very affordable, and lentils are very easy to prepare, as we'll see in our recipe later on. And then finally, we've got edamame, another form of soy, and it contains about 18 grams of protein per cup. And these are just young green soybeans. I eat them as snacks sometimes. My family buys dried ones, and we just kind of top that on top of like a granola. But they're a great source of essential amino acids, which we're going to get to, protein quality. So they're a complete protein. And yeah, they're really nice to add to just grain bowls or to salads and whatnot. Okay, the next slide, we've also got a couple more options here. We see our beans make an appearance here. But first we have some chickpeas, which provide about 15 grams of protein per cup. Once again, chickpeas are also very versatile. You can blend them into hummus. We've made several chickpea containing salads at the clinic before. Once again, a great source of fiber and iron supporting heart health. And then we have hemp seeds. Now, this is something I learned from Dr. Curnew. Maybe I'll let Dr. Curnew explain how he incorporates hemp seeds. But hemp seeds have about 9 grams of protein per 3 tablespoons. So they're very much rich in omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, which we're going to get to later. They're great for anti-inflammatory impacts and then also for brain health. And what I believe is a good way to include hemp seeds is sprinkling them on maybe a salad or a smoothie, but I'll let Dr. Curnew maybe explain how he incorporates hemp seeds.
So hemp seeds are a richer source of alpha-linolic acid, which is the vegetable form of omega-3 fatty acids. The only problem with its conversion to EPA and DHA is only a couple of percentage. So it's a healthy fat, and it's and for vegetarians, they can have low levels of omega-3s, and so this is actually one way of doing this. All these are great choices. In fact, you remember, I'm having a salad right now. I'm just going to, I think I have some flaxseed and I'm just going to add to my salad right now. So I don't think I have any hemp seed right now available, but I do have, I'm heading off to the fridge over here. And what I do have is, I'm just going through the fridge here and I'm making a mess here. And find it right now. You keep talking. I'm looking for something.
You know,
You keep
while you do that, we had a question. Maybe Angela knows the answer to this question. We had a question in the YouTube chat about um, plant-based protein powders and if whether that's a good tool for people to use. I don't know much about them. If I were to guess, is that it's a tool in the toolbox, but what are thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead.
maybe I'll give an answer and then Dr. Curnew, maybe you can add to it after. Our take on supplements, and Jenna, maybe you can add as well, at least is knowing what you might be deficient in and what you might not be obtaining enough of, or if you're doing strenuous activity, etc. Knowing your individual needs is important before considering maybe supplementation. I think they might be referring to like soy protein or whey protein powders. That being said, it's always best, and this goes for all supplements, it is best to get, if you have access to the food, the whole food, it is best to get the nutrition from that whole food. Oftentimes supplements, their components might not be as effective. You might have to take large amounts. And if you're not deficient in a certain nutrient and you have the capacity to obtain it from a whole food, that's always going to be the better option. Maybe Dr. Curnew, you want to
Yeah,
add?
I think first of all that the composition of plant pro plant pro plant-based protein is not quite as strong at building muscles compared to some other sources, but you can eat higher amounts and get that amount there, so it's not a problem. And so we're talking about plant-based protein. One of the things that I do because um, I'm trying to get more protein, and I have to do things quick and fast. So I get egg whites in those cartons, and I put all the vegetables in the world into them, and I put throw in some other stuff there too as well. And I find I'm doing it that way. Where my son, who's much younger, stronger than myself, has his vegan plant protein powder he puts into everything. I rather, like yourself, get all my stuff from real food. I think Mother Nature has a secret formula, and we as humans we mess up on that. There's this beautiful vitamins for males over the age of 50 or so. And I think we're spending billions of dollars on them right now. Mine are outdated. Every once in a while, I throw one in there and gives my urine a nice yellow tinge to it. So I get a more expensive urine, but how much benefit I get, I'm not so sure. But all the foods that you give me here give me superpower and things of that nature as well. So I found I had this organic flax. I'm going to put my tab now. It has to be grinded to get the omega-3 releases right now. And I just sprinkle it on everything. I find it's very, it's like a little nutty flavor to that, filling and things of that nature. So I get my alpha lipoic acid to some degree. I'm not sure if you can see that, but here's my salad with lots of beans and a little bit of fruit and things of that nature as well. And so I sort of like that. And I put balsamic vinegar on everything. Now, I should spend more time on apple cider vinegar because that actually has a better lowering of blood sugar. So, but because the balsamic vinegar still has a little bit too much sugar content. So those are some tricks there. But I don't care which bean you eat, but just eat lots of beans. And if you eat a cup of beans a day, you're so well ahead, and it's you're just healthier. Period.
Yeah. So I guess our response there is that there's no harm, but we're presenting some options here that hopefully you can incorporate to get those whole protein sources. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide then. So on this slide, really quickly, we chose 3 different types of protein sources here that we've just discussed, just to go through nutrition labels, because I know it's nice to sometimes kind of compare and contrast. And here I've put 18 grams for 100 grams. Honestly, sometimes different sources will have different things. Roughly for most of these beans, you'll find, 20, 25, 18, like around that range is how much protein you're going to get from a cup. So very much comparable to meats or similar servings of meat. But we see here we've got high protein content from soybeans. And then also we have a little bit more in-depth description about this later. But soybeans are complete protein, so they're comparable to the animal protein source. And that's often a concern for people that are trying to look at plant-based protein alternatives, is that they're not going to get those complete protein sources of a higher protein quality. Soybeans are one that address that gap. We've got healthy fats, so soybeans contain about 9 grams of fat, and these are primarily those heart-healthy unsaturated fats that we discussed before that have anti-inflammatory effects. And then we have low in sodium, rich in fiber. So this is a big thing. Fiber is, and we're going to get into this later, but fiber is one of the things that you're going to get by making the switch to plant-based proteins. So we got 6 grams of fiber here. Ultimately, we might reiterate this many times throughout the webinar, but fiber is important for supporting blood sugar control, keeping you satiated. So also promoting digestive health and also helping to reduce your cholesterol levels. So it's got a whole trifecta there, or multifecta. So you want to increase fiber, and that's one of the things that you're going to get with these plant-based protein sources. But here I'd like to highlight some other areas. We've got potassium. We've got about 515 milligrams of potassium. Now the daily recommended amount of potassium is about 4,700 milligrams. And I know that me and you are probably not consuming that much. We're probably consuming more salt. And this is this salt potassium imbalance that we've talked about in videos before. Soybeans are a great source to get that potassium, in addition to calcium. So oftentimes if we're reducing perhaps dairy and animal products that way, we might be losing calcium in that process. It's another thing to highlight, that a lot of these plant-based protein sources that we're highlighting today do contain calcium. And you can build and add with these sources to kind of, you don't have to eat, 200 plus grams of soybeans, but you can combine it with other things. Dr. Curnew is eating a relatively bean medley with seeds and other veggies. And that's going to give him all sorts of aspects or components of these nutrients from various sources of plant-based protein. And actually what you'll find in studies is increasing your protein diversity to more than 4 protein sources actually supports cardiovascular health. It reduces blood pressure. It reduces the pressure on your heart, and helps diversify your nutrient profile. Okay, next slide. We've got...
So just remember is that if you were trying less salt, if you replace salt with potassium, as you point out, you lower blood pressure, you lower stroke. And, if you eat a variety of foods, you get complete proteins. You don't have to really think about this. Soy is a complete protein, but you eat a bunch of plants, different colors, different whatever, you get all the protein and more at a very cost-effective way. And it, if I remember correctly, 25% of greenhouse emissions are from food. So we can make a big dent in this area.
Exactly. For the sake of time, maybe I'll just skip through some of these, but tofu, we've got 21.8 grams of protein in half a cup of tofu. And then also we see here, depending on your source, I think some sources have about 400 milligrams of calcium to about 800 milligrams of calcium, but another great source of calcium over here. And then on the next slide, we've got lentils, and we've talked about this, but lentils are really that high protein source, high in fiber. They're made up of about 25% protein. And then I put these ones into daily value. Oftentimes when you're looking at a nutrition label and a lot of these nutrients, you're going to see on the right side that they indicate percent daily value. This percent daily value tells you how much of the recommended intake that you're consuming in a day. So for something like folate, iron is what we wanted to highlight here. You're getting about 37% of your daily value. So yeah, like Dr. Curnew said, you're getting that protein. Combining these, you're going to ultimately get those complete proteins, and we'll dissect what that complete protein means, but to debunk what people often say to promote more red meat consumption. But yeah. And here we've added a comparison of plant-based meat alternatives. And this highlights actually burgers. I think when I started to see trends in plant-based alternatives or plant-based meat alternatives kind of arising, a lot of it was in fast food chains and processed versions of a plant-based burger. So that's what we've highlighted here as sort of like a consumer warning for everybody here. But as we see, the trends remain here, that we've got a reduction in that total fat compared to a lower lean ground beef. But something I want to mention here is that, well, this might be self-explanatory, but we see this increase or this improvement in nutritional value. But for some of these, the total fat isn't really changing. And that might be because with sometimes buying these processed versions of plant-based meats, you're going to have a lot of added fats or sodium added to these. And Brad, if you'll skip to the next slide, actually, some of these things are intuitive, right? Obviously, a plant-based alternative is not going to have cholesterol since it's not animal-based. It's going to have that increase in dietary fiber that the meats won't necessarily have as much of. But as we can see here between brands, there's differences in that saturated fat and sodium. And so that's just a consumer alert. We've discussed here a lot of really great whole options, ways to cook lentils and beans yourself. Those are the plant-based alternatives we want to talk about today. Dr. Curnew, when we went to that game the other day, we had that bean burger. And that was actually, that one tasted pretty fresh. It was pretty good. It was black bean burger. But when you're looking at the ones at the grocery store, these are where we want you to just use your discretion when you're looking at nutrition labels, and make sure you're looking at that saturated fat and sodium that, you know, we're hoping to reduce with a plant-based alternative, but can sneak in. Yeah.
We went to the Cat game and they actually had, you know, a bean burger, so I think it's kind of neat and stuff like that. So, you know, the ones that you can't believe it's meat and stuff like that, they're a healthier version. They still have some bad things, but you get, you know, you can make your own with beans or get more, you know, if you can read the words, they don't sound like too many chemicals, more beans and things in that you can add different versions of that, and they're quite tasty.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, on to the next slide. We just highlighted this really quickly, but and we're going to get into lipids a little later. But in this study, researchers examined how red meat, white meat, which we consider lean meat, and non-meat protein sources affect atherogenic lipoprotein measures, and particularly in the context of low versus high saturated fat intake. What they found was that red meat compared to non-meat protein sources resulted in higher levels of atherogenic lipoproteins, which are linked to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Additionally, that white or lean meat showed intermediate effects, being less harmful than the red meat, but not as beneficial as plant-based protein sources. And your non-meat protein sources, the plant-based protein sources, those were associated with lower lipoprotein levels compared to what you're seeing here, the higher LDL cholesterol, and apolipoprotein B, which I'll get into really quickly, and how that ties into triglycerides, which we'll talk about later. But those are observed to be higher with that higher the higher fat intake and the, you know, with either red or white meat. So what we're seeing here is that plant-based proteins are your better bet. And I mentioned apolipoprotein B. That's a protein that plays a key role in lipid metabolism. It's a primary component of certain types of lipoproteins and a key marker for assessing cardiovascular risk. Since atherogenic lipoprotein particles contain ApoB in them. And so ApoB can reflect the number of harmful lipoprotein particles that are circulating in your blood. And this higher level of ApoB, as we're seeing here, is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and events. And how it ties to triglycerides is that ApoB is primarily a marker of lipoprotein particle count. This includes LDL and very low density lipoprotein. So it's indirectly related to triglyceride levels because of that very low density lipoprotein, which carries triglycerides. So it can be another marker for contributors to cardiovascular risk here. And another study that we talk about later also mentions it again. So yeah, we're seeing plant-based proteins once again are rising up as being a better option here. And on the next slide, for the sake of time, our cooking club has done a really good video on a class on what's in the glass. We like this video because it touches on things like alcohol, but it also touches on plant-based milks, which we're not going to discuss too much today. But once again, alternatives to those dairy products that you might be consuming that have that higher milk fat. I know some people like, you know, the higher percentage of milk fat for their coffee or whatever. But there's alternatives to this, and we encourage you to check out this webinar, not just for the plant-based milks, but Dr. Curnew talked about alcohol earlier. this is a great video to check out alternatives for alcohol too.
So one of the things that if you just backtrack, so what I've tried to do is that I'm switching a lot more to oat milk. From oat milk, I use a lot of oat milk. I like the flavor of it, but the texture. But I'm also putting to almond milk, for instance. Reason for that is like going 30 calories. Where like skim milk is 90 calories per glass, regular milk is 150 calories per glass. So calories are important to me. So things like almond milk um, are are kind of neat. So I think the nut milks are really something up on number one list. And I still drink skim milk to some degree. So I basically I cut down a lot on my dairy consumption and replace it a lot with plant-based milks. But I still have some dairy from time to time, but because there's casein, protein, and dairy may be important for muscle building and things of that nature. And I think I try to get the best of all the worlds there right now. But try some plant-based milks, and soy milk's quite nice too. Usually I try what's on sale. Like this week I got soy milk's on sale. Was I think two cartons for I think $6 or something, and so that's what I bought this week. And some weeks it's you have to pay full price. I hate paying full price on anything. But, tell us more.
I think what you mentioned, Dr. Curnew, in terms of just being open to trying things and don't box yourself in. There's room to grow in our diets, and we're here to learn. If it's buying a sale item and that's your way of trying something, that's the first step. So yeah, our next section, because we really want to put this webinar into your perspective, whatever age you are. I know we've talked about a lot of individuals that might be at risk of developing chronic conditions, individuals that might be at risk of sarcopenia or frailty, or might be looking for fall prevention. Building muscle is crucial. But I think, and we have some stats on this, whatever age you are, it's really important to be building that muscle now. And that's crucial. So incorporating more plant-based protein sources, as we've seen so far, and for the remainder of this webinar, are really what we want you to be thinking about when you're thinking of dietary changes, as well as how to incorporate both muscle building and plant-based proteins as integral elements into your diet. But this section, we did target a little bit more to individuals that might be of an older age and at risk, as Jana mentioned before. But this is an alarming stat, and one that should probably stick with you beyond this webinar. And that is that we lose about 3 to 8% of muscle mass per decade after the age of 30. And this rapidly accelerates after the age of 50. And on the next slide, what that actually equates to is about, for between 40 and 80, is about 30 to 50%. Brad, if we'll just go to the next slide really quickly. So yeah, it's about 30 to 50% of a decrease in muscle mass. Dr. Curnew say this often, that we lose about half our muscle mass as we age, and the stats do back this up. And what this means is that this might leave some individuals frail at an older age, but it also means that some people might be replacing that muscle mass with fat mass due to aging and other factors such as lifestyle, poor diet. So we have body composition scales at our clinic, and we've invited patients during our workshops to come and assess their muscle and fat distribution. If you're a patient at our clinic community, we encourage you to keep an eye out for those workshops so you can better understand your body composition and weight. But as Dr. Curnew mentioned or showed his body composition earlier, it's important to understand your weight distribution. What is muscle? What is fat? So then we can better understand what next steps you should take in terms of things like muscle strengthening and losing weight or managing your weight. And we have a lot of videos on our channel that go more into strengthening exercises. We have a lot of experts at our clinic that have a lot of knowledge on resistance training and strengthening. So in this webinar, we're going to focus more on diet, but we did link a webinar that was done recently at the end of this webinar, and we'll show that a little later. But for the sake of this, we wanted to kind of put this into something that you can apply when you're better understanding your health. And that is starting with the acceptable macronutrient distribution rate, or AMDR, as some of you may have heard of. And this is a range for macronutrients, so your protein, carbohydrates, and fat, that promotes nutrient sufficiency and then also reduced risk of chronic conditions such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So for protein, this is about 10 to 35% of your daily caloric intake. So once again, if we're looking at that 2,000 calorie a day diet, that's about 10 to 35% of that should be protein. And we just really quickly did a sample calculation for everybody on the next slide in terms of taking, so here we put a target of 20%, which is kind of in the middle, and doing 20% of your 2,000 calories. So we're looking at 400 calories from protein and then converting that to grams. So a gram of protein is about 4 calories of protein. So that's about 100 grams of protein a day. Now, 10 to 35% equates to about 50 to 175 grams of protein. One thing we want to mention is most of us are likely consuming enough protein from our diet. However, there's some individuals that might be at risk due to other conditions that they might have, where they might not be reaching these ranges. I still recommend everybody do these kinds of calculations to better understand what your energy requirement is and then how you distribute that and can visualize it. Putting it into grams allows you to visualize, how much protein you might need to be consuming at each meal. We talked about timing that protein throughout the day. And yeah, so it's not necessarily a calculation that might apply to you just because your estimated energy requirement is going to depend on your age, your BMI, your physical activity. So it's important that you can use online calculators to calculate this for yourself. But ultimately, this isn't to limit what you're eating, but we've talked a lot about, limiting unnecessary calories. Understanding what your energy requirement can help you in building that diet, not to restrict you, to help you better understand how you distribute certain things like protein here. And on the next slide, Brad, what we've added here is anabolic resistance. And what this is kind of tying back to our dietary protein intake. So anabolic resistance refers to the body's reduced ability to build muscle in response to dietary protein intake or physical activity. And this particularly can occur in older adults or those with chronic conditions with age, inactivity, or poor diet with inflammation. And ultimately, these factors, as we can see here with the arrow, are impairing muscle protein synthesis. So as a result, individuals with anabolic resistance can experience a decline in muscle mass and strength. And we know that protein is essential for building muscle. And the type and quality of protein consumed does play a significant role in overcoming anabolic resistance. So this is where the debate we kind of talked about earlier. Oftentimes, people will say animal proteins or animal-based proteins are typically considered to be more effective in stimulating that muscle protein synthesis due to that complete amino acid profile that they might carry by themselves. And we're going to get into leucine, which is an amino acid that contributes to triggering a lot of this muscle protein synthesis. But on the other hand, plant-based proteins, which, we're trying to debunk the rep that they're getting here, in combination can contribute to complete proteins and stimulating that muscle protein synthesis. So on this slide, we see just amino acids. They're the building blocks of proteins. There's 9 essential amino acids. So this is what people are talking about when they talk about complete proteins in containing this amino acid profile. And then leucine, which I've just highlighted here. And then on the next slide, what we see is that I know we talked about mixing and combining protein, but there's actually a lot of plant-based protein options that are complete. Quinoa is one of those things that we did a whole grain webinar or video. And we've had a couple of workshops where we've incorporated quinoa a lot into substituting rice. We see here that it's got about 8 grams of protein per 1 cup, which is very, very attainable in eating a cup, replacing, your rice with quinoa. We also got soybean, which we talked about earlier. I've added hemp seeds again. We've got chia seeds here, or spirulina, and buckwheat, which you can consume as kind of like an oatmeal. And then these are the combinations that we just put over here: brown rice and beans. Beans are rich in lysine, which is one of those amino acids that grains can sometimes lack, like rice. Similarly, here we've got the pita. The hummus is supplementing that lysine. But ultimately, I think many of us can agree that we're probably eating things like that already. So this isn't something you necessarily have to worry about. This is more so us just debunking anyone who says that your plant-based proteins aren't those complete proteins, because they likely are. You're consuming them the correct way. And it,
If I might just interrupt, Angela, I was just having a thought about cost. Now, not that cost is a prohibiting factor, but I was just thinking about it because part of the reason, especially now in the States, there's a lot of talk about what I don't want to go into politics, but there's a lot of thought about what people eat and how can you incentivize people to eat healthier. And I was thinking you can actually budget these things and have the same exact cost and transfer the funds from the junk foods all the way to the plant foods. But I just Googled it right now, compare the cost of rice. I'm a big rice eater. Compare the cost of rice in Canada with quinoa. So it's about 6 times to 7 times the price. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to completely replace it, but um, I'm curious as to how the cost difference will be. Imagine if we had an extra column here. I'll just look into that after, but maybe Dr. Curnew knows more about the exact cost of these things. I'm not a regular customer of all these little things that we have on the table. Some of them I am, some not. But
So,
just a thought I had. You can let us know, Dr. Curnew. What do you think?
so basically, fish is very expensive. Meat is very expensive. Dried beans they're cheap. Um,
Right.
so you can eat healthy for very little. So just get your own beans and soak them. They're much cheaper than the canned version, less in salt, um, and my son does his meal preps once a week or so. Makes spends 2 hours and cooks about 10 meals for the week and stuff like that. And it is working on a student budget. He eats really healthy, really well, for a fraction of cost. You go out to I don't know, you buy a Big Mac and super fries, whatever. It's $10 or something. You can actually do so much better, so much healthier on your own. Now, he loves protein and everything. He buys the extra milk, dairy with protein, and he loves his protein shakes, and he'll get the vegan protein. But I love quinoa. He makes a whole bunch of quinoa for me, and we freeze some of it. I make as many beans as I possibly can, and every once in a while, I just soak. I take my beans here. So here's some beans here. All you do is just soak them, heat them, and let them cook for a while. We're going to talk about one of my favorite foods so far is pea soup. And man, that's a great soup. So I think you can eat. It's easy to eat for less and healthier.
Yeah, I'm just gonna add, I'll take my word back. I was just thinking about, I just Googled it as well. So if somebody's a vegetarian in Canada, you can expect to save from $1,400 to $2,300 a year, switching from the more common balanced diet with meats and different kinds of meats to vegetarian diet. Or it doesn't have to be exclusive, but a more plant-based diet with some of the things we have here, some of the things we've shown. So there's some statistics as well. $1,400 to $2,300, quite a bit of money.
So
and to
what I'm
put
going
in,
to do when I go home tonight is that I buy those frozen blueberries, those big bags, and I'm gonna take some frozen blueberries. I'm gonna take some flax, some chia, put a few nuts. Gonna put a little bit of skim milk. Gonna put a little bit of almond milk in there, and that's my dessert. And pretty darn good, pretty good, pretty healthy. Yes, like fresh fruits and vegetables, especially in the wintertime, are very expensive. So the frozen varieties are important, and get a garden. And we also have microgreens that we have a nice video on and things of that nature as well. So there's so many ways of doing this. Is that we have to get the number one, what surrounds your plate should be beans and vegetables, and that's the starting point. And then grains, whole grains, and water is the number one
times,
beverage.
if you put a number on the quinoa, I think I buy a bag. I don't know how many grams it is, but it's quite a big bag for maybe like $20. But I've used it multiple times for our workshops at the clinic feeding. I think we never finished 2 trays. We've never finished 2 trays, and we had about 20 plus people there, and we barely made a dent in the other tray. So it does go a long way. And a lot of these things with the beans and lentils and quinoa, you'll see you don't need to the dry weight equates to a larger amount when it's cooked, and you can store these things for longer periods of time. And Dr. Curnew mentioned like a big thing for a lot of us that are In university, I think I could spend maybe $20 on campus on something that gave me no nutritional value at all. So when I consider maybe allocating that $20 to something like quinoa, um, there's some benefit there. So thanks for mentioning that, Dr. Curnew, and Brad for bringing that up, because that is obviously a big barrier. When we talk about barriers to accessing meals like that, obviously affordability is a big one. But in this context, when we're looking at plant-based proteins, there's ways to navigate it with those dry beans that you can buy for very cheap. So yeah. And on the next slide, what we've done is just highlight that muscle protein synthesis. So leucine is one of those essential amino acids we've mentioned, and it's got that crucial role in stimulating muscle protein synthesis by actually activating the mTOR pathway, which is a key regulator of muscle protein synthesis, as we can see in this schematic. And it acts as a trigger to activate the pathway. And oftentimes, yeah.
So leucine is a key amino acid involved in building muscle. What foods are rich in leucine?
So I've actually got so that's what the rep is, that, the leucine rich foods are your animal based proteins. And that's where a lot of the discourse comes from. I just highlighted this part of the schematic, and that oftentimes when you're consuming a higher amount of leucine, there's this extra side of fat mass and food intake. So you might be consuming more calories from those, animal proteins with the saturated fats. On the next slide, I have listed some plant-based proteins that are actually relatively rich in leucine. So upon a literature search, apparently the leucine threshold required for optimizing muscle protein synthesis is about 2.5 to 3 grams per protein dose. But we've just discussed quite a bit about combining these sources. So for example, a chicken piece or a piece of animal meat would have about maybe like 2.7 or more grams of leucine in it per serving. And we've got comparable amounts here for soy protein derivatives. Even with the lentils and black beans and hemp seeds here, like these are all things we can mix to achieve that threshold. So once again, we're debunking this focus on leucine, focus on amino acids and the complete protein sources that are often used to push that animal protein. I'm not going to call it an animal protein agenda, but to push more for animal proteins. And I did just mention here, as long as Dr. Curnew mentioned, as long as you're consuming these sources that we've just mentioned today, which are very much attainable, and you can see that diversity in your plate, you don't need to nitpick on these nitty gritty stuff like the amino acid composition. It's good to know. But we've included it here for those that maybe want to investigate it a bit more further if you are at risk for sarcopenia or for any of the chronic conditions that we've mentioned before, and with age as well. So
You can't remember all the different what beans you should have. Just have a mixture of all of it, then you don't have to think about it.
Exactly. Okay, so on the next slide, we kind of total out this. I mean, one of the questions we had for this case study was, how much protein do you need? The Canadian guidelines say about, I think Jana mentioned 0.7 to 0.8, but about 0.8 grams per kilogram of your body weight. Dr. Curnew mentioned earlier that that can be greater, that can be closer to 1.5. The newer guidelines actually are increasing it to 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So ultimately, on that higher end is what's going to promote the muscle protein synthesis that we want to achieve for muscle strengthening. And I just put here an example of calculating this once again. If you're 140 pounds or 63.5 kilograms, you're likely going to consume about 63.5 to 76.2 grams of protein. With that extra part increased to 1.5, that might be more, but relatively in our same range for those AMDR calculations we did before. Okay. And we add this to all of our webinars because we understand that by analyzing diet, it can often be hard to visualize it in your own life. Now, Canada's food guide does not rely on servings. It relies on this plate. We have it in our clinic. Hopefully patients are seeing it. We put it in every webinar. And what I've highlighted here, as we see, your plate has half a plate of fruits and vegetables, quarter plate of protein foods. Now this push for plant-based. I think the Canadian guidelines could have more of a push for these, but they do recommend consuming protein from more plant-based sources, but then also lean meats. And then we have our whole grains. And you can already see here we've got plant-based protein scattered throughout all these portions of this plate. But I think from this conversation, Dr. Curnew, don't you think the beans should be maybe a bigger portion there? They're kind of small. So just ways to kind of see how you could visualize adding these dietary changes of increasing your plant-based protein and where maybe in this plate from the Canada's Food Guide they can fit into.
So I
Okay.
guess just take a picture of that and just aim for a plate that looks something like that, you know?
And that's often the conclusion from a lot of these webinars is that you're never going to get the servings down right unless you're trying to follow a very strict diet that requires those serving sizes. But this is something that you can easily visualize and incorporate into your life.
Actually, the Danish recommendations, I just came across it. I'm not sure if it's new. I think it was 2021 or something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody knows. It was completely plant-based, and you had different pictures of exactly the same kind of food. Also, for look at calories, guess what they mentioned? It was water. Pretty much similar, but there was no mention of meat. So they've made the switch. So the Nordic countries are always ahead when it comes to healthy behavior. Maybe we can take some notes. Seems like we have.
So to me is that if you can aim for those who love meat and fish and other or whatever, have a portion, replace portions of you know, so try to really avoid processed meat, avoid processed food in general as much as you can. Replace some meat servings with beans and I don't really go out of my way to eat beef or meat or chicken, but if it's there, someone serves to me, I won't turn it away because I don't want to kill anything except for fish, unfortunately. But I'm trying to use as many beans as I possibly can, and you can't eat too many beans.
Okay, awesome. And I'll just skim through some of these nutritional benefits. We've already been talking a lot about these. Fiber is one of these things that, 25 grams per day is recommended for women, 38 grams a day for men. And on average, most of us are consuming under that. Obviously, there's no fiber or valuable fiber in animal protein sources. So you're going to get your fiber from those plant-based protein sources. And we've talked about some of these benefits. Here, I've just put a bunch of examples of some of these sources, as well as the fiber content. So if we look at lentils, that's a great source of fiber. Chia seeds, chickpeas, these are all really great sources of fiber. Really anything that you saw on that plate that's whole grain or in the plant-based protein section is going to be a good source of fiber, or the veggie section. Okay, on to the next slide. Muscle strength. That's another big thing that the big debate here of whether animal or plant-based protein sources are going to support that muscle strengthening. So the data is kind of limited, but I did find a meta-analysis here that found that there wasn't a significant impact in absolute lean mass and then in muscle strength that was measured in these studies through strength markers, such as these exercises. Percent lean mass was impacted by animal protein, but what we're seeing here is that there's no significant differences, at least in literature, that is to point out that one protein source, when we're looking at animal versus plant, is going to overpower an increase in muscle strength. So if you're interested in, muscle strengthening is something you want to work on, plant-based proteins are going to give you the same, or relatively the same impact. But what these studies found was that there was a significant increase with protein supplementation. Just the protein source is really up to you. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you're making the best choices for what those protein sources are. Okay. And I believe over here, so once again, we just kind of reiterated here, combining those legumes with grains that can complete an amino acid profile that supports that muscle protein synthesis. But we've got other studies, a meta-analysis here that shows that comparing animal protein versus soy protein, once again, there wasn't a significant difference found in strength and lean body mass between the groups. And these are all long-term studies looking over 3 or 6 weeks.
So grains are healthy, and if you add whole grains to beans, you have complete proteins, period. Not to think about it.
Exactly. Really quickly here, I mean, this is one thing we talked about, those animal protein sources, obviously, because they're animal derived, they're going to have cholesterol, which is not found in your non-animal protein sources or your plant-based protein sources. So that's already a one-up. But then when we look at saturated fat, there's a significantly larger amount of saturated fats in your animal protein sources, and not just the red meats, but if we're looking at lean meats, even, it's comparable amounts. if I was looking at this, I'd likely go for the soybeans if I could. And once again, this is just another study that's showing substituting the animal protein for plant-based protein significantly reduces your lipids or improves your lipids. Here we have LDL reduced by 0.16 millimole per liter, as well as non-HDL reduced as well. And then that apolipoprotein B marker as well, reduced by 0.05 grams per liter. So once again, supporting your lipid profile. I think we can skip over this, but just getting to know your fats and what your unsaturated or saturated fats are. Antioxidants, we've mentioned this in all sorts of our webinars, but if you're eating more plant-rich sources of food, you're going to have more phytonutrients or plant nutrients with antioxidant properties that are going to neutralize free radicals or reactive oxygen species in your body that come from a variety of factors, such as poor diet and poor lifestyle factors. So they're going to reduce that oxidative stress and inflammation that contributes to atherosclerosis and increased cardiovascular risk. So for example, soy contains isoflavones and lentils are rich in polyphenols. These are just a couple of examples. And yeah, this is one thing I wanted to mention here. We don't have to go through this fully, but I think I've heard this a lot about, I did a workshop recently and someone asked, I've been told I need to consume more iron and that's why I eat more red meats. But if you look at the comparison here between a beef patty and a cup of lentils that are cooked, there's a larger amount of iron in the lentils. And they actually contain about 82% of your recommended daily intake. So right off the bat, lentils are going to be giving you that other component of iron that, for example, a red meat counterpart isn't going to give you, or will give you, but to a lesser extent. So that's just debunking another thing there. And I think our last slide for this section, really quickly, is just gut health. So we talked a little bit about red meats. Carnitine is found in animal products like red meat, and it's actually metabolized by gut bacteria into TMA or trimethylamine, which the liver converts to this TMAO or trimethylamine N oxide. So certain gut bacteria, particularly firmicutes, are responsible for this process. And what we know is that elevated TMAO levels are linked to an increased risk of cardiovascular diseases, as TMAO can enhance cholesterol buildup or atherosclerosis. And also, another thing to mention here is that animal protein consumption is also linked to the growth of gut bacteria, such as bacteroids. And these thrive in bile and can promote inflammation. So they're pro-inflammatory. Sometimes we call these gut bacteria, sometimes they can be beneficial or harmful, but these ones can lead, with the pro-inflammatory impacts, can lead towards the more, I think they call it detrimental or harmful bacteria. In contrast, though, with our plant-based proteins, we're encouraging the growth of beneficial bacteria. So this is such as bifidobacteria and lactobacilli, and these promote gut health and anti-inflammatory components. So there's just a little bit there on how animal versus plant proteins might impact your gut health. And this is something that Dr. Curnew kind of wanted us to mention. We've alluded to the environmental impact, the environmental impact of the decisions that you're making in your diet. Really quickly here, these are things you probably already know, but just to reiterate, animal products require a large amount of land usage to grow feed crops and to allow livestock to graze, and this results in habitat loss. Even with fishing, so aquaculture, fish farms, that can result in habitat destruction as well. We have greenhouse gas emissions, and I actually have a couple of slides on exact numbers, but various greenhouse gases such as methane, which I'm sure all of us are familiar with, can be produced by livestock. And then we have pollution, so water runoff of animal waste into water, bodies of water, which can result in pollution and harmful components that find their way and build up in our systems through eutrophication. And then water consumption, because it takes a lot of water to sustain livestock. On the next slide, though, we put some comparisons over here. You can see that when we look at the carbon footprint of meats, beef has by far the largest carbon footprint. There's no doubt here that if you're eliminating one meat, as Dr. Curnews mentioned, one meat that you might just disregard, if not for your personal lifestyle or your personal health goals, for the environment, it might be beef. Fish comes, a little bit there as we're tapering off in our animal proteins. And then we see our plant-based proteins make up these, very much smaller carbon footprints. And so that's just one visualization of how the impact of your dietary changes are really making an impact on the planet. And then here we see that this is actually comparing diets. So we have a vegan diet on top, but the vegetarian diet actually contributes to roughly about a twofold greater increase in greenhouse gas savings compared to a diet such as the Mediterranean diet. And what are the differences in these diets, right? It's animal meats, lean meats are included on the Mediterranean diet. Still a very healthy diet, but we're seeing that a vegetarian diet is so much better for the planet. And that really should be one motivator for in this era for dietary changes as well. And the impact of plant-based foods on the climate are about 10 to 15 times smaller than animal products, which we've seen through these visualizations as well. Okay. Really quickly, we are hoping to do a little bit more of an in-depth dive into triglycerides, but we've talked a little bit about them as fats to look out for, not just on your blood work, but in your diet as well. Normal triglycerides are considered to be about less than 1.6 millimoles per liter, and we have a 3-1-1 rule that we follow at the clinic, which is getting that as low as possible. You can see at the bottom over here.
Well, just backtrack one slide. Go back. So this 3-1-1 rule, if you heard 911, you get sick, go to the hospital. 3-1-1, you stay home and live forever. So you want a total cholesterol less than 3, HDL greater than 1, triglyceride less than 1, LDL less than 1. Those are the ideal values. And one of the things is that triglyceride above 2 is basically a marker for diabetes to happen. And right now is 2/3 plus of Canadians are in the process of developing diabetes. And if you have a big waist, your stomach arrives before you do, and your triglyceride greater than 2, you have insulin resistance, you will develop diabetes in the future. I started off that way. And guess what? I'm 65 and my blood sugar is spiked right now. So I had a warning. I worked at it. I didn't work hard enough about this. All the white foods, white sugar, white flour, the only white foods you should be eating is maybe a little bit of skim milk, white onions, cauliflower, but basically white foods are detrimental to your health. Unfortunately, alcohol, any degree of alcohol makes triglycerides problematic, get more activity. That's one of the fats you can actually lower because roughly 80% of your LDL cholesterol is controlled by basically genetic factors, 20% is by diet and lifestyle changes on average. There's a great variation to that effect, but that's numbers. But triglycerides, you can basically lower your triglycerides very dramatically by losing weight, exercise, no alcohol, plant-based eating or fish-based eating, whatever you like to think about these sorts of things. So, and next slide, please. One of the things that really came to age, next slide, please, Brad.
Is this one's okay?
Yeah, next slide.
Next one? Okay.
All right. So one of the things is that interesting what to do about omega-3s. This is from our book, and this looks at vegetable forms, alpha-linoleic acid. You can see from walnuts, hazelnuts, canola, flax, hemp seeds, etc. And they're weakly converted to DHA and EPA. Vegetarians live a long time, but they're relatively deficient to omega-3s. But despite that, they have some issues. EPA and DHA are the building blocks of brain, eyes, cognition, and cardiovascular health. And this is taken about, you can look at how to do this. Next slide, please. Very interesting. These are the diets we should think about and how we do it. So refined carbohydrates, processed foods, give it up. Trans fatty acids have been taken away, but there's still some natural ones there. We want to have, plant-based foods, monosaturate fats, they lower risk cardiovascular disease. We didn't talk about a lot about whole grains today, but they're rich in fiber, they're very healthy. You can be on some people go to these high fat, high protein diets, low carbohydrate diets, and they actually help you lose weight initially. It's hard to sustain over time. You can have a paradoxical rise in LDL cholesterol, especially if you have the saturated forms, but you can be on a healthy diet with just high fat, you can get through lots of good plants. But it's probably not a diet sustainable, and you lack the micronutrients and the benefit of fiber and whole grains. So it's not a diet I tend to recommend, but if you want to try that version, you certainly can, but it's hard to sustain. Next slide, please. Is that can you just backtrack? Is there a slide before then? Is that so we have the 3-1 run rule. There you go. Next slide, please. And this is something that I'm struggling right now, insulin resistance, and I think most Canadians are. And this happens to be my blood sugar monitor. I put this is the fourth attempt at this right now, and we have a really beautiful video you should look on monitoring your blood sugar. Right now, my blood sugar is 5.3, and my daytime average over 2 days is 6.1. So 6.1 average blood sugar is not the same as a hemoglobin A1C. If you can look at a hemoglobin blood sugar, let's say of 6, the average hemoglobin A1C would be 5.2%. And if your average blood sugar is 6.4, your glycosylated hemoglobin is 5.4%. So really important to understand the differences. Glycosylated hemoglobin is red cells that get transformed by blood sugar, and blood sugar is what you measure in your bloodstream. And you want just enough in your bloodstream, and the rest you want to go to your muscles and use for energy burning. You don't want too much because it damages your cells. So this is what I'm hoping I can change that effect right now. So I worked very hard. I got my weight down. I'm eating lots of plants. I'm building lots of muscle, maybe a few injured muscles here and there. We go that way. Next slide, please. So this is something that I can do, you can do. And having the right foods and diets are wonderful. So if I can do it, you can do it. Meals and recipes. Let's hear a little bit more. Ooh,
Brad,
my favorite soup. Tell me more. How do you
Brad,
make good soup?
I was just gonna say, maybe if you want to skip just back to like 2 slides, just really quickly. Um, this was all of us in the one out. So we have a really good video on diet and combining diet and exercise, which we didn't get to today. But this is all of us at the clinic that did the CN Tower climb earlier this month. And I think we can all agree that that was definitely a challenge for some of us. Maybe not for Dr. Curnew and Brad, but for some of us it was. So a tidbit or just a takeaway for the end is try new things, challenge yourself. What's a challenge for you might not be a challenge for someone else, but if it's a challenge that a previous you couldn't do, it's still a step forward in progressing to a healthier future. And yeah, I'd say like that's just a takeaway for there. But for the meals and recipes,
Go back to that picture again. So that was a fun day there, and we had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I dragged my son and my daughter. My son was happy he did it, and my daughter, I think she was, but we had to go home afterwards. She said she had a headache and she couldn't stay for too long. But I think, Rad, I think you halved your time if I remember correctly. Now, if you replace quinoa with from brown rice, you'll shave off another minute or so off your time there, and you'll be able to beat me soon. But
That's true. No, that's on the books. That's the plan.
and uh, and actually, it was a lot of fun, and this is for the United Way. It happens every October, November, and then in I think Aprilish or so, the Animal Society has a CN Tower climb. Come climb, and so I had a good year this year with that. So I had a good climb. And basically, you got to beat the old man like this next time. You guys got don't be nice to the old guy. Have fun, do it, and we can do the Chinook stairs from time to time. Thanks for sharing that slide. Next slide, please.
okay, so to end this off, we have Dr. Curnew's favorite pea soup recipe here that we adapted a little bit. But Dr. Curnew, feel free to maybe change what you would add.
So go back to, so how do you make pea soup? What do you do? What do you do? You just, how do you, so I just say pea soup, but how do you make good pea soup? What do you do?
So you make it like any soup in general. We put here some like a recipe that we adapted a bit here. Some soups will ask you to include some oil, but you could just increase your water for that. But here we're using an unsalted vegetable stock that we replaced from a chicken broth in this recipe. We're using our split peas here, and then no salt, all to taste, is what we're adding here in terms of seasoning. And maybe I'll explain one of the recipes for the sake of time. You're making these in similar way. On the other side, I added a curry version of this. But essentially, you'd be sauteing your softening. Here we're using onions, celery, carrot first, or you could add it to the stock too. But for the curry, you would saute that first, after which you would add your stock, water, depending on if, I know for the curry, we usually cook the beans or the split peas or lentils beforehand, obviously rinsing them. I believe in this recipe though, they would have, I'll have to check. Maybe we can link the recipe below for this one, but I think they would have maybe added them to the stock. Um, but yeah, really simple in terms of like soup, curry. These are just mixing things together. Um,
Some
Brad,
people add a ham bone to that or some ham, but you don't need to do that. Um, and if you do actually add ham to that, make sure you let it cool and skim off the fat as it will rise at the top at the end of that. And one neat way of getting fat is you take a spoon, put it in the freezer, and then dip it, and then the spoon will the fat will stick to the spoon. But I think pea soup is just wonderful. I have j'habite à la belle Provence, and pea soup is a real staple there in Quebec. And so, but this is a much healthier version and wonderful. Thank you. Next recipe. What else can you tell us next?
I think we're gonna maybe we can add the recipes below, Brad,
Okay.
take a time. But that rounds off our webinar. So our conclusion, oh, actually, we just added the microgreens here because Dr. Curnew mentioned I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, and we've learned a lot being part of the cooking club from the patients in our community. One of them is a patient here, Ian Adamson, who actually runs their own microgreens business called Greenbelt Organic Greens. And I added the website there. But the ones you'll see on the left are actually microgreens that I've continued to grow. So I started in August and now I do it every once in a while. And that was added to some salads and some sandwiches. And I think we're going to try to do it in the clinic again, although I am a little bit wary about um, who's on watering duties. Um,
Yeah, I think I destroyed quite a few of them by forgetting to water them. So and and this guy here, he's wonderful. He's he's mastered microgreens and man, oh man, they're really good. So take a look at that video and get his stuff. It's he's great. He's good for the planet. He's good for your health.
Exactly. Okay, and I think that ends off our webinar. Maybe we can put these quiz answers in the chat or in the not chat in the description box below. But Dr. Curnew, if I remember your answers correctly, you did answer all of these correct. So
Well, it's interesting about protein. First of all, there's a debate whether or not you have to scatter out through the day or all at once and things of that nature. I'm I'm what I'm trying to do is I'm eating more time restrictive eating, and I feel so much better. What my pattern of eating right now is changed, and I don't eat in the morning. I just have coffee in the morning with some skim milk, soy milk, or some other forms, and I try to exercise in the morning. I feel euphoric for the first number of hours, and I've already exercised, so maybe I'm going to break your rule by waiting over 4 to 5 hours afterwards. But I don't think it makes a huge difference. Uh, the, yeah. So, but please try different times. I'm going to try play around with. I'm going to try to eat less at nighttime and more during the day there. But I'm looking at my blood sugar right now. Is that my blood sugar is highest in the morning? So, way not to get my blood sugar to go high in the morning is not to eat and to exercise. And but I'm still working on that and trying different things. So right now my blood sugar is 5.2. What's yours? I don't know, but I don't. You don't have to do it all the time. But it's kind of fun to do this. Tell us about the next answers.
so for um for the rest of them, Dr. Curnew said maybe for the second one, sarcopenia refers to the natural age-related loss of muscle mass and strength. I guess this is the textbook definition over here of sarcopenia. And then we had resistance training combined with adequate protein intake can help prevent or reverse sarcopenia. Dr. Curnew also said partially true. And I think from what we didn't really get to this part in the webinar, but Dr. Curnew is alluding to a video done by our weight loss group called, I think it's time restricted eating and high intensity, I think I'm functional training. But in that video, they go over a bit about resistance training and diet. I think I linked it, but we recommend you check out that video too. And maybe Brad, for the rest of them, we'll just put the answers. We'll put the answers in the description
So
box.
basically, you can't stop the aging process, but you can slow it down. The number one priority people should think about is really controlling what they eat, the quality of food, and the quantity of their foods right now. And I think it's really important is that, having adequate protein, having adequate resistance training. I think the biggest one that we've forgotten is resistance training. If you want to live well, healthy, you got to lift weights. If you're not prepared to lift weights, you're going to go closer to a nursing home. And if you're going to go around eating 60 to 70% of your food by processed food, you're going to be overweight. The food industry has done a wonderful job of creating really delicious food that tastes good, that's cheap. Unfortunately, that's killing us. And it's time to fight back in some way. Liquid calories are liquid calories. So the best liquid calories is water, plain water. We all get bored a little bit, different variations of that. And we can do better. And you showed us a great example. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenna and Jenna. You guys have done a wonderful job. Brad, any final thoughts from your perspective?
One thought I have is that I probably have to find some Middle Eastern bean recipes and try to incorporate that into my diet and then go from there. And also the fact that next time you want to sell somebody on a plant-based diet, mention the cost. I bet that would sell it for you. That's quite good. That's quite convincing as well.
You have a cup of beans every day of your life, you will live better, longer, and you'll have more money in your pocket. And the environment will be a better place. What more can you ask?
So I guess our main takeaway is that everybody has to go eat some beans over the next 24 hours. That's your homework.
Perfect. Well, listen, I want to thank everybody for a wonderful presentation. Any questions from anybody at all in the audience or anything like that? Jenna, do you have any final thoughts at all yourself?
Yeah, not too much to add. I think that, yeah, even thinking about myself as a student, I was really intimidated by the gym, but I think that like learning about these webinars and the importance of building protein and importance of building muscle and thinking about diet, that's really inspired me to work out more. And yeah, I think that I've definitely noticed some improvements about in like terms of like physical conditioning other sports and um yeah, I'm sure that it'll be very helpful when I'm older as well. So, yeah.
Well, I think it's time to do a few push-ups. And Brad, you gonna do a few too? What about
I'll
that?
do it. I'll do it.
You ladies can do
I
some
just
with
can't hear you for 30 seconds. All right.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 27, 28. That's all I can do. 28. That's not bad.
That's amazing, Dr. Curnew.
Oh. All right, that's gonna help build up a few muscles. And we bid you all good night and happy push-ups and happy beans. Whew.